May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be pleasing to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. This is sort of an interesting comparison that Jesus makes to a mother hen. We don't necessarily usually think of God and chickens in the same sort of mindset. But it's really common in the Hebrew Bible for God to be likened to a mother bird. And a mother hen is particularly interesting because mother hens are known both for their ability to nurture and their gentleness and for their fierceness. There are videos you can find of hens protecting their brood from eagles, of hens staying on their brood, even in the midst of fires, and protecting them, even at the sacrifice of themselves. Mother hens are fiercely loving and deeply gentle at the same time. What a beautiful image for God's love. But Jesus also makes another point. We have a tendency to run away from that love, even when that love is longing to gather us close. The Sunday school is also doing this lesson today, and I really like the paraphrase by Reverend Anna Strickland. So I'm going to read that to you. I can get to it. There it is. Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. King Herod was not happy with some of the things Jesus had been saying as he was teaching all around Judea. Some people came to warn Jesus, telling him, "Get away from Jerusalem. Don't you know Herod wants to kill you?" But Jesus was determined. Herod is like a fox, and I am like a mother hen trying to protect the people of Jerusalem like a flock of chicks. How I want all my baby chicks to be safe under my wings, but time after time they run away and turn on the very people God sends to protect them. Still, like a mother hen, I will not stop loving my flock. So here we hear God's great longing for us. We hear about God's incredible love for us. And there's another message. It's there in that word determined, how determined Jesus was. All three of our lessons today talk about enemies. And that made it rather hard to figure out how to preach today. I was like, ooh, these are intense. But it gives us a really good idea of how Jesus dealt with those who wished him harm, who wished his people harm, and what we can do when we are facing hardships or facing those things that are seeking to harm us or harm those we love or those we seek to be in solidarity with. Jesus was determined. Rather than fleeing and leaving his flock unprotected, he came right in the face of Herod and said, "No, I'm continuing my work. Look at the work I am doing. I will not be deterred from my call to love my flock. I will not be deterred from my call to cast out demons, to liberate, to free, to heal. I am continuing along the path of love toward that cross in Jerusalem where he gave himself in the act of great self-giving, love for the world." So, in this theme of enemies, we get to Philippians. It's kind of a strange passage, I think, where Paul talks about enemies of the cross. Now, scholars don't agree. There's no scholarly consensus on who these enemies of the cross that Paul is weeping over might be. Some think it's Epicureans, those who saw individual pleasure as the highest good. Some think it was Roman cultists, those who worshipped the emperor and worshipped Rome's power and enabled Rome to continue to oppress millions of people the world over. But we really don't know. What we do know is that the cross is the ultimate symbol of self-giving love. The cross is the ultimate symbol of love overcoming power and violence. It is the ultimate symbol of love poured out for the world rather than power built up for self-aggrandizement. And And so we can surmise that enemies of the cross are those who do not love that way, those who love power and violence, those who want to harm rather than heal, those who would rather build up their own power for themselves and for their pleasure and for their privilege and harm others. And it might be easy for us to come up with a long list of people we would put in that category. But this is Lent, and Lent calls us to self-reflection. So I want to invite us to think about when we become enemies of the cross. When do we choose violence and power over love? When do we choose our own privilege over using our privilege to build up those who have less? When do we choose hatred and the world of empire, the world of Rome, over the least of these, who Jesus calls to himself? When do we become enemies of the cross? Now, the good thing is that Paul tells us we have the option of being citizens of heaven instead of enemies of the cross, and of making the cross our highest ideal, which means at least two things. When the cross is our highest ideal, that means we run toward God and his outstretched arms on that cross that call all people into a loving embrace. And it means that we seek to walk in the way of the cross. We seek to walk in the way of love. We seek to pour ourselves out in love for others rather than building up power just for ourselves or just for those who are like us. And then we get to the psalm. And in the psalm, this psalmist feels besieged. There are enemies everywhere. There is hardship everywhere. Everywhere the psalmist looks, there is something to fear. And we come to what I think is the third temptation we see outlined in our readings today. The first is when we face enemies or face hardship, is to turn toward our enemy and focus all of our energy on our enemy and lose track of our call. Lose track of our mission, to do the opposite of what Jesus did, to get so bent out of shape and so consumed with looking at our enemies that we stop walking in the way of love. That's the first temptation. I think the second temptation is to become an enemy of the cross, to become like those we are seeking to resist, to become like those who we are angry at for their violence, for their oppression, for the things that they are doing, to take on hatred, to take on the way of violence, rather than continuing in the way of love. And the third is to become consumed with fear, and then to give up again on our mission to walk in the way of love, to follow in the way of Christ. The psalmist begins with so much trust, with so much faith, with this sense that you are my light and my salvation, my enemies will be overcome, I will be safe. And then the fear creeps in. And suddenly there's this temptation to believe that maybe God will disappear. Maybe God will turn God's face away in anger. Maybe God will abandon the psalmist. The psalmist ultimately comes to the place where I think we also are called to come, to a place of seeking God's face, of waiting faithfully on God, on turning as Jesus did. He turned his face toward God, toward his call, and away from fear. That is our call as well, to turn our faces toward the God who longs to pull us in like a loving mother longs to protect and nurture her brood. We are called to love and be loved so that we can be empowered to do what we are called to do. What Jesus says the law and the prophets are summed up as: to love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your mind, all your body, and all your soul, and to love your neighbor as yourself. Yes, even that neighbor who looks very different from you, even that neighbor who you don't understand, even that neighbor you feel frightened of, even that neighbor you dislike, to love that neighbor as yourself. So I think the call from all of these passages today is to keep our face trained toward that cross, toward walking with Jesus in the way of love, toward a refusal to be deterred in our call to walk as Christ did, to imitate Christ, to love as Christ did, and to listen to Christ's words, and to come close to Christ, gathered in, like chicks running to a mother who will protect, who will love, and who will never give up on us. Amen.